it has been a pleasure to team up with the LEGO Foundation once again and take one step forward in our research process and translate the showcase of SEL innovations from our previous report to something that policymakers could use. So I'm sitting here with Crystal, with our head of research, and my first question for you is, why a policy report?
Thanks, Clara. Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and I think we've been thinking about why a policy report from the perspective of what is it that policymakers want. And maybe there are a lot of things, but I think one of the primary things is evidence, right? We'd like to have evidence-based policy. And there are a couple kinds of evidence that we can give. One is scientific research, and I think something that we're elaborating in this report specifically are the kinds of evidence that our innovators have produced to show that their innovations are working. A lot of them are collaborating with universities and research institutions to do all kinds of research to show how their innovations work. But the second thing, besides scientific research, is also practice, to show evidence through practice. And that's also what we're trying to give in this report.
So we are talking here about bringing evidence from the practice to the policy. So my next question for you is, what is the relationship between SEL policy and change in education?
I think, part of this question just has to do with how does policy in general make change in education. One of those is to think about policy as a vehicle for systems reform. So how is it that making a government policy, a national policy, even a state policy or policy at any level, how does that make change? How does the government make change when we think about policy in those terms? So the other way to think about this, policy as the politics of decision making. So we're thinking about resource allocation and how it is that these wider government structures or non-governmental organizations are creating documents, mandates, commitments that then articulate how it is that resources should be allocated, in this case specifically for SEL and education. So then you're thinking about the role of organizations like UNICEF or UNESCO or the OECD, even the World Bank, and the kind of political documents or policy documents that they are putting out that give an indication of how it is that resources could be and should be allocated towards social and emotional learning.
That's a very interesting point. Actually, what we've been seeing with our 13 selected innovations is that if they were able to pilot their project, if they were able to create the infrastructure to implement this SEL project and even monitor and evaluate their process to then iterate it, is because there was funding channeled towards these kind of projects. And this means that there's foundations, governments, different institutions interested in funding SEL projects. So my next question for you is, why do foundations, governments, and other institutions integrate SEL as a policy mandate? Why are they interested in investing in this kind of projects?
Yeah. So I think that this question about why a policy for SEL and why are these foundations making those mandates, or why are they making those commitments? First of all, it just has to do with, again, the role of policy generally. Policy is a support for action. So anytime you have kind of a government document where teachers, school leaders can kind of reference that and say, oh, well, look, here we have the mandate that we need to do this. That creates a space in the system where then teachers, innovators can put time and energy and resources into doing social and emotional learning because they kind of have the basis there, the rationale before it in the policy. The other is in terms of SEL research specifically, we see a growth in these policies around social and emotional learning in combination with a growth in the research about social and emotional learning. So we have more evidence now that social and emotional learning leads to improved outcomes for students, and you're starting to see that reflected in local, state, national, and international policy movements. But the other piece of research is that we're starting to understand better actually not only the sort of outcomes based, but also understanding learning better. What is the relationship between cognitive function and affect and socialization? Our understanding of that is improving, but the way schools are organized doesn't necessarily reflect that still. So this is another piece of how education policy changing is also kind of laying the foundation for there to be system reform in education. So these first two things are about the sort of bolstering the policy rationale, the reasons for why it is that we're doing social emotional learning in schools. But the third thing is policy, again, gives a space for there to be funding. It gives a space for there to be, more specifically, resource allocation. And that's something that is really important. And it's been really important for all of our innovators. You can see that they have had support from governments, but especially that they've had support from partners and foundations to give them the space to innovate, to try something new, to do pilot programs in different places. And those have always been really well supported by the commitments of different foundations. And I think that then opens this question for policymakers of how is it that we can make innovation more sustainable within the public system when we currently have, at least for the innovators that we have highlighted, a situation in which it is often the case that these innovations come out of the private sector or they come out of incubators or something like that. And then only after that, then there's the possibility to take it into public education, and then not necessarily with like a strong sort of financial foundation for how to continue the innovation in that way. So to me, that's still an open question after this, is how is it that the public system can create the space for innovation to happen?
That was a very interesting point, Crystal, and actually it reminds me to some of the cases we've seen in this report, and we just heard from this implementation story from Mexico, and this is the perfect example of an innovation that started its development outside the public system through foundations, and slowly it started this dialogue with the governments, and it reached the point in which the innovation is sustainable because they got this partnership with the government. So here we can see the importance of these innovations partnering with the governments. I would recommend anyone here to go visit our report, our policy report, in which we explore a bit further how these connections between the innovations, the governments, the funders are working and how they are implementing SEL at scale. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to partner once again with the LEGO Foundation and work together in our shared goal of fostering education innovation in the field of SEL, and especially with this report promote SEL policy for a better impact in our education systems.